And now I'd like to turn to introduce Emeritus Professor Bruce Chapman, AO, FASSA. Bruce will present his open lecture on a topic of huge significance for Australia and the rest of the world on HECS-HELP, history, effects, international comparisons, and the University Accord. This slide lists some, but not all, of Bruce's achievements. He obtained his bachelor's degree with first-class honours in economics from the Australian National University and PhD in economics from Yale University. His first academic appointment in Australia was at the University of Adelaide, which is where he met Slade. He returned to his alma mater, ANU, in 1984 and has remained there for the past 40 years, apart from secondments to the Hawke-Keating governments in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Bruce is renowned as being the main architect of the income-contingent loan scheme for students, known as the HECS scheme, or Higher Education Contribution Scheme, in the first instance. It was introduced by the Australian government in 1989. This has made higher education accessible to generations of students. Since then, Bruce has translated the concept of income-contingent loans to higher education systems of many other countries, especially in Latin America. And recognising that the concept goes well beyond student loans, Bruce has translated into many other socially beneficial applications. These include drought relief for farmers, paid parental leave, protection of endangered species, JobKeeper, fine payments for minor crimes, and government grants to potentially elite athletes. He has received many honours, including the Order of Australia, Fellowship of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, appointment as the inaugural Sir Roland Wilson Chair of Economics at ANU, and the Australian Financial Review's Higher Education Lifetime Achievement Award. During his presentation tonight, Bruce may tell us that he's a cricket nut who corresponded with Don Bradman when he was a boy, and later authored with Julian Blackman an economic analysis of Bradman's value to cricket. Well worth reading. Our viewers tonight, please note that Bruce is available in real time, as I said at the beginning, for Q&A following this presentation. Please write your questions in the Q&A feature on your screen. With that said, Bruce Chapman, welcome to the Royal Society of New South Wales, and we will begin to play your recorded remarks.
Good evening, and thank you for tuning in for tonight's presentation. My name is Bruce Chapman. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm speaking from, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would also like to thank Professor Slade for inviting me to make this presentation to the Royal Society of New South Wales, and to say that Christy's wonderful mother, Gwen, was an extremely important influence on me as an academic and as a teacher, and I think about her role in my life quite a lot. And also to say thank you to Emeritus Professor Lindsay Botten for doing the webmaster duties. I've been a difficult person because my technical skills are very weak, and his are wonderful, and I thank him for his patience. The talk tonight is about the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. It was the reintroduction of university tuition in Australia in 1989. I was involved in it, and I want to take you through that journey. I will be talking about the economics of the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, but I'll also be alluding to and describing some of the issues to do with the politics and the public policy of the higher education contribution scheme. I do this in part to draw some lessons about what it means to be an extremely naive academic involved in the cut and thrust of politics and public policy. I learned a huge amount. I was a very innocent academic then. I think I'm still an innocent academic, but not as innocent. The politics was extremely complex. It had many dimensions, and I'll be touching on that. Again, thank you for being here. The opening point in terms of the history of the higher education contribution scheme is that university fees were abolished in 1974 by the Whitlam government. This is an issue I'll be discussing in a little bit of detail, but the important point is that for the students involved, there were no university tuition charges from 1974 until the Labor government reintroduced the beginnings of fees called the Higher Education Administration Charge. That happened in 1987, and Higher Education Contribution Scheme occurred in 1989. John Dawkins was the minister, Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister. The background is that there were two basic reasons that John Dawkins and the Labor government wanted to reintroduce university tuition. Number one, the government simply needed the money. And number two, there was a strong view in that cabinet that so-called free education was both inequitable and unfair. The issue that confronted John Dawkins as minister in 1987 was that university applications, the number of people wanting to attend university, had increased extremely rapidly from about 1984 onwards. And these are the data. So from 1985 to 1988, the number of people who wanted to attend university had gone up by about 35%. This meant a very big issue for the government because a free system means that it's paid for by government. And so the government, to satisfy the applications, was going to have to find a lot of money in which to accommodate the expansion, given that this was a Labor government that was not at all interested in being seen as a high tax and high spend government. The second reason that John Dawkins and indeed that cabinet wanted to reintroduce university fees was the view that so-called free university education is inequitable. And let me try and explain what this means. The whole concept of free is not meaningful to economists, and a so-called free education only means free to the students. It doesn't mean free, it doesn't just drop out of the sky. It is paid for by all taxpayers. And the vast majority, of course, of all taxpayers are not university graduates. And at that stage, we're only talking about 10% of the labour force who were university graduates. That's the first point. The second point is that the returns to higher education for the individuals, for the graduates, are very high. On average, graduates will earn about an average $1.5 million a year more than non-graduates. Of course, there's huge variance in this, but there is no doubt it's one of the strongest findings in economics of education is the major private benefits that come about through being a graduate. The bottom line was that not charging tuition fees would be regressive. That's the opposite of progressive. Regressive means distributing resources to the advantaged and away from the disadvantaged, and thus it was inequitable. It's important to understand that the people on the so-called left of politics may not realise that Karl Marx himself was an advocate of university tuition. And this is a picture of Karl Marx. It's a figure that most economists don't know what he looks like, but Karl Marx wrote in the Critique of the Goethe Program in 1875, quote, "If higher education institutions are also free, they're Karl's inverted commas, not mine, that only means, in fact, defraying the cost of education of the bourgeoisie from the general tax receipts." What does that mean in contemporary language? It means having tax resources provided by all taxpayers for people who are privileged. So Karl Marx was himself an advocate of university tuition. Let's ask this basic question. Why do we need student loans anyway? isn't this just a market? And if it is a market, why do we have government intervention? And the reason is very straightforward. The investment in higher education is risky. Something like 20 to 25% of people who enrol in Australian universities at the undergraduate level do not graduate. Some people can get poor jobs. Some people can experience illness or look after unwell parents and not have high income. So if you go to a bank and you say, I'm very motivated, I did well at school, I'd really like the money to pay for tuition, no bank will give you that loan. And the reason is that it's not just the risks that matter, is that there is no collateral. So if a bank buys you a house, which you pay a mortgage, then the bank owns the house, and in the event that you default, they can sell the house. But in the event that you default on a student loan, how should I put it? The banks can't sell a brain. And so there's no saleable collateral. This is a very risky investment for a bank. And there is no government in the world that I'm aware of that allows banks, or there will be no banks involved, unless there is a guarantee of repayment. And that's a critical point. So without that guarantee of repayment, there has to be some form of government loan system. And there are two types of loan systems. One is called time-based repayment loans. For example, they operate in the main in US, Canada, Colombia, China, and Japan. And that's like your housing mortgage. It means you'll have a set period of time in the United States, 10 years, in which to repay a student loan debt. And it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. If you're poor, that's bad luck. You still have to pay. And if you're rich, that's fine. You won't have any problems. And the basic problem I'll explain in a minute, but that can be compared with the other type of loan, which is called an income-contingent loan. And they now exist in Australia, New Zealand, England, and Hungary. And that's a loan in which people repay only when and if they are able to. That's essentially what HECS is. These are the powerful implications of income-contingent loans are the following. Here's the big point. Income contingent loans have repayment obligations which depend on income, not time. And as a consequence, that means is if a future circumstance of a graduate is not very good in financial term, there is no payment requirement. And repayments only come about if a debtor's income exceeds a certain level. That is, so there's no repayments when people are unemployed, if they're in low-paying jobs, they're looking after children full-time. So the right word to think about when we think about income contingent loans is insurance. And income contingent loans provides insurance for borrowers because it means that if they're worried about their future capacity to repay a debt, they don't have to because there is no implication, there's no one chasing them to repay. And the other and related point, it's going to be better for the government's revenue. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So with income contingent loans compared to normal loans or time-based repayment loans, point number one, there can be no repayment hardships if it's designed properly. Point number two, possibly the most important point of all, there is no default. You can't default on a HECS debt in any kind of official way, but that's not true with time-based repayment loans. In the United States, something like 13 million people currently have defaulted and are seen to be defaulters and a very high credit risk for banks. Their lives are in big trouble because of the default. That will not happen. It cannot happen with an income contingent loan. So because it's paid back depending only on your income, it's progressive over lifetimes. The people who pay quickest and pay the most will be those with the highest income, and the people who pay the least, some of whom will not pay anything, earn the lowest. It's also very efficiently collected through the tax system. When we designed this, I didn't think we realised what a plus that would be, but it's turned out to be, in administrative terms, a very favourable aspect. There is another implication for governments. Because no one is defaulted, no one gets defaulted out of the system. So if somebody doesn't pay for 3 or 4 years, for example, they're looking after a newborn child, that's no problem because the government can get the money back later. If they are defaulted out of the system, that's the end of the revenue stream for the government. Where did HECS, which is an income contingent loan, come from? It really began with my options paper, which was delivered to John Dawkins in December 1987. When he first employed me, this is kind of weird and a bit interesting, but he was warned against employing me because he was told that I was a bit politically naive. I think that is a major understatement. And just to give you some context about my conversation with him on that afternoon in December 1987, I'll relate the unfortunate incident of the Dorothy Dixer. So Dorothy Dix was a Lonely Hearts columnist in the 19th century in the United States. And the concept of a Dorothy Dixer is a parliamentary term, which means a minister is invited to respond to a question to show off, basically. So every second question in the House of Representatives or the Senate goes to the relevant minister, and the question is one that they organise for them to say how wonderful their policy is. So when I first got to John Dawkins' office, somebody said, it's time for a Dorothy Dixer for the minister. And a friend of mine, Peter Noonan, in the office, he said, here's a good one. How about we ask the minister to answer the following question: what are the number of single mothers in Western Sydney at the university now because of this wonderful Labor government? That was the Dorothy Dixer. And somebody said, but we don't know the answer, to which there was a couple of fingers pointed at me, and they said, well, that's why we're employing this guy. So I was asked, could I get the data? And I said, with great confidence, yes, of course I could get the data. But I didn't know that that was meant to come up in 3 hours' time. I could have got it over a few months of quite a struggle. So, of course, I didn't have any idea that it was needed now because I didn't know that the Dorothy Dixer was coming up. But it did come up, and I wasn't there. I had messages everywhere saying, please go to the down to Parliament House straight away. Please talk to the minister. We have a problem. We have a problem. He was very unlucky. It was the first one off the ranks, and he was then asked the most unfortunate Dorothy Dixer, possibly in parliamentary history, to which he didn't know the answer. That is the number of single mothers in the western suburbs of Sydney because of the Labor government, to which he answered he did not know, and could he have it on notice. The opposition had a lovely time. He had a very unlovely time, and he made sure that I had a very unlovely time after that experience. This is all context for the unfortunate meeting I had with John Dawkins in December 1987. I turned up, I'd written an options paper, I'd covered all the things that I thought could possibly be considered, including bank loans, including scholarships and bank loans guaranteed by government, and also this concept of an income contingent loan, which I clearly favoured. The way options paper gets written is that if the author wants one thing in particular, it's written in a way to encourage that one thing. And this was HECS, but he was sceptical, as he should be. The important point is that when I arrived, this is what he looked like. He kind of looks okay, doesn't he? I would say relaxed, comfortable, at ease with the world. That's what he looked like. About 20 minutes later, he didn't look like that at all. He asked me some fairly basic questions. Let me go through the questions with you. First question, how do you know it will work? He said. I said, well, I don't. That's a pretty good response, isn't it? Second question, how many other countries do it this way? And I said, well, none. Well, none that I know of, which made it look like I didn't really know. There was a pause. In fact, all through this, there were pauses. They were getting longer. They got longer and longer. Third question, what will the students think? And I said, well, the students will really hate it because everyone else had it for free and they now have to pay. So even if it's got wonderful features like insurance, they won't like it at all because their brother or their sister got it for free, and they'll think it's very, very unfair. Long pause. Next question, what will universities think? I said, the vice chancellors, they won't like it at all because you're not giving them any research money. That's what they care about, is research money. They're all kind of old school Whitnamites. They've got a great affection for what happened before. They won't be your friends on all this. Very, very long pause. Here's the killer question. when do we get the money? Because remember, that's what they were doing this for, at least in part, to which I said, well, if you grandfather it or grandmother it and grandparent it and you don't introduce it except for the new cohort coming in next year, and it goes and they don't have to repay any of the money until they earn average income. It was much higher then. It was $76,000, not the $52,000 it is now. I said they'll have to go through the system. The money will start trickling in, about 7 or 8 years. This is not a very satisfactory answer when the average level of a government, length of time of a government in the House of Representatives is 2.5 years. So he listened to this and this is what he looked like. And I remember looking at him and thinking, I wonder what he's thinking, because he just looked bewildered. And this is what I thought at the time he was thinking. I think he was thinking that. And I asked him a few years ago when we kind of got a bit nostalgic about all this, and I said, do you remember that extraordinary meeting we had in December 1987 in your office? To which he said, how could anyone forget that? And I said, what were you thinking? And he told me that that's exactly what he's thinking. Who let this moron near economic policy? So let's ask the big question, why did he do it anyway? It sounded crazy. It sounded like there'd be no money. It sounded very risky, but he still went for it. And I think that the reason he did go for it was simply because the major reason that I think John Dawkins went for the higher education contribution scheme is because of the huge affection in the Labor Party for the Whitlam government, who had abolished fees. What HECS was different, and it was kind of benign. No one had to pay up front, and you only had to pay if you were earning above average income. And he needed something gentle to convince Labor caucus and the Labor Party generally that this was a good idea. The 1974 fee abolition is really an extraordinary piece of mythology, and I'll give you some background to this. And I should say, before I go into this, that I was a great fan of Gough Whitlam, and I think that government in the 1972 to 75 period did wonderful things. But one of them was not the abolition of fees. And I remember when Gough Whitlam died, which was about, I think it's exactly 10 years ago this year, that at his memorial service, Kate Blanchett, the wonderful actor, said that the most wonderful thing that the Labor government had done was the abolition of tertiary fees. And I thought that was pretty strange. And the reason I thought it was pretty strange is because the people who needed protection from fee abolition, the people from poor backgrounds, they'd already left schooling by the time they got to the end, would have got to the end of schooling. They were leaving at age 14 and 15 because they were the ones who went to trades and to be unskilled labourers. So the socioeconomic mix of the group who got to year 12 was pretty much the same as those who went to university. They were from the advantage side of the track. And the other thing is that there was major scholarships. There were Teachers College scholarships and there were Commonwealth scholarships which excused fees. And I can remember this point being made in John Dawkins' office by a senior public servant who said, I thought a little bit riskily at the time, don't worry about it, only the rich dumb ones paid fees, Minister, because all the others got scholarships. There was only 25% paid. And she did use the word rich and dumb. There was silence in the room and John Dawkins looked a little embarrassed and he said, well, I paid fees. His secretary of the department, Vince Fitzgerald, who was probably ducks of his school, said quickly, I paid fees too, Minister, but I don't think he did. So HECS came about. There were struggles. I'll talk a little bit about the struggles, the political struggles essentially, but it was instituted in 1989. What it meant was that the government got a lot of money, or had the promise of a lot of money, about 1/3 of all the costs. And in his first budget, John Dawkins increased the outlays in a number of places by about 15 to 20%. And over this period of the last 35 years, there's been an increase of about 250 to 300% expansion in university enrolments, It's now commonplace for people to go from high school to university. About 40% or more of people do that. When I was a student, when HECS was introduced, more importantly, that number was about 10 or 12%. There was increased expansion of the access of the poor, and that's because the system got bigger. And the other consequence was international. Other countries were having trouble with university student loans, and in different forms, not all like HECS, in fact, many not quite like HECS, in different forms, income-contingent loans were introduced in the countries that I've listed there. And there's currently debates going on in about 5 or 6 other countries. I now want to look at other countries, exploring the time-based repayment loans and the international experience of what we call repayment burdens. So remember what a time-based repayment loan is. It's not like HECS at all. You have to pay it no matter what your income is. And we developed this concept called a repayment burden to try and understand this. So a repayment burden in some period I, like this year, is the amount of money that you need to repay a loan as a proportion of the income that you receive. It's a very important concept in understanding student loans. We have calculated for many different countries the repayment burdens, that is the proportion of a graduate's income that they need to repay a loan in non-HECS type systems. We've just done it for young people because that's where the problems are. And just to illustrate how important it is for the relatively low income graduates, the data I've got in front of you now show the repayment burdens for the bottom 20% of graduates, young graduates, in about 7 different countries. You can't read that. I'll tell you the countries: Brazil, China, Japan, US, Chile, Colombia, and South Korea. Those repayment burdens for women, for the bottom 20% of graduates, are 100% or more of their income if they are low earning graduates. And for men, it's also close to 100%, except for a couple of countries, but the lowest is 30%. Even in very high income countries like the United States, the repayment burdens of their college loan system are close to 100% for the lowest college graduates in those countries. So those repayment burdens that average about 40% in all those other countries and can get up to well over 100% for some. Let's compare that to the repayment burdens that we calculate for countries with income contingent loans. Here are the answers: Australia, 10%, New Zealand, 10%, England, 9%, Hungary, 6%. And why is that? It's because the policy itself is designed to have a maximum repayment burden. That's what HECS is. You cannot pay more than a certain percentage of your income, and it maxes out at 10. For most people repaying a HECS debt, it's about 6 or 7%. A few obstacles along the way. Obstacle number 1, the Australian Tax Office. When I was interested in this process, and the committee was with me developing HECS options, somebody had to go to the Australian Tax Office. I thought it would be quite a pleasure. So I went along to the Australian Tax Office in July 1988 with this new beaut idea, and I had a little speech. I said, this is a wonderful opportunity for the government to finance the major expansion of the university system. It requires the administration of the Australian tax system, because the critical point is the debt is only collected when and only if people have got the money to pay. So we need to know what their income is. And I thought that they'd say, what a great idea, but they didn't. The first person, there were 2 men, the first person said, well, we're not going to do that. More or less said, you can leave now. And when I looked dumbfounded, he said, you don't know much about economics, do you, Sonny? Well, he didn't say Sonny, but he meant Sonny. He was quite patronising. I actually thought I did know a little bit about economics, but he said, I'll explain economics. We are the tax office. We collect taxes. We do not collect debt. And every time I went back, there was another problem. He said, people will die, and they will die with these deaths. And I said, well, I don't think this system's going to make more people die. And then here was a good one. He said, women, have you thought about women? He said to me. And I thought, well, I hardly know him. I don't really think that this is an appropriate place for me to discuss that topic. He said, I'll tell you about women. And I said, can I take notes, please? He said, women will go into this system after they've had babies. They'll marry brain surgeons on the North Shore of Sydney. They'll have children, and when their children have left, they'll want to go to university, and they won't have to pay anything because it's a debt of the individual. So you'll waste all this money. It's completely unfair. Well, the only way to respond to an idea like that is look at the data. The data that I'd seen said this was not at all true. The vast majority of women pay back as close to as much as men do. So it wasn't true. And that was the only way I thought I could win that debate, but I wasn't winning it. And in the end, after about the fourth meeting, one of them said to me, who's on this committee anyway? And I named a few people. And one name I mentioned was that of Meredith Edwards. And I said, Meredith Edwards on the RAND committee. And he said, oh my God, he looked at his friend and he said, we're stuffed. I didn't know what that meant, but I soon found out. Meredith Edwards had been involved in the introduction of the Child Support Agency, which is an income-contingent debt that's collected on the basis of a non-custodial parent's income, and it's delivered to the custodial parent. What is this? It's an income-contingent debt arrangement. In other words, they were already collecting income-contingent debt. And so they kind of knew I'd find out, and they kind of gave up at that point. A few years later, I went back to try and extend the Austudy loan system into a voluntary, if people chose to, system of income contingent debt. And I had to see the same guy, one of the same people. I really thought it would be horrible. He met me at the lift and he said, hello, Bruce, great to see you. And I said, hello, Jeffrey or Richard, I forget now, great to see you too. And then some strange things happened. I sat at his desk and I gave him the spiel. I thought I'd be talking with him for at least 4 hours and 3 meetings, and he'd always say no, but he didn't. He said, that's a great idea. When do you want to start? And I had nothing to say because I couldn't believe it. And then we just sat there in silence, and he said, have you seen our HECS pens? And he showed me the HECS pen. This is a photograph of the HECS pen. Your tax office can help, it said. Then he said, we've got a HECS balloon. It's unbelievable. You go out to the Canberra show, the Australian Tax Office used to have a stall there, and they would distribute HECS balloons. They were very proud of HECS balloons, and I don't know how many young people would be very excited about going to the Australian Tax Office stall, but the balloon was there waiting if they did go. There was a HECS video which explains to year 12s what happens if they enrol in university so they don't get frightened, and it wasn't to advocate HECS, it was to explain the process. There was a HECS mouse pad, there it is. A HECS bookmark. This is the most extraordinary thing. There's a HECS board game. Like Monopoly, if you throw the dice and you get an odd number, you're really unlucky, you go to university. And if you throw the dice and you get an odd number, you're really unlucky, you graduate. And you throw the dice and you get a high income, you're really, really unlucky, you have to pay back HECS. That's how you play this game. I've played this game. It is the most excruciating, boring game you could imagine. Could you think of your child, you're saying to your 6-year-old, gee, you've been good today. You've been so good, let's play the HECS board game. Well, it's not going to work, but they loved it. And just to show you up close, you can see that. You can see what it says about the throwing of the signs, throwing of the dice, and how to play the HECS board game. I couldn't understand why HECS was fought so bitterly against and then adopted, but it's basic political economy. They do their best to stop things that they think are not good ideas. And once they're adopted, they love it and they endorse it. And the tax office became famous and completely wonderful in the administration of HECS. This tax office resistance is a universal phenomenon. It's all over the world. And I've seen Dennis and Jeffrey, I'll call them, the ATO people, I've seen them in many, many countries saying in many different accents what they told me at that meeting. Just to remind you, Dennis and Jeffrey, the Australian Tax Office in Canberra, 1988, here they were. That's what they said. It's our principle not to collect debt. It won't work anyway. It's impossible. That's where they were in Australia, but they found me in the United Kingdom, the same guys. And they said the same thing. Don't be ridiculous. It's impossible. There they were as Harold and Richard in the UK. Here they were in the United States of America. Wayne and Brad, I was there about 5 times. And Alex and Ross, same guys, different names. Don't be ridiculous. That is impossible. It wasn't just English. Here it is in Spanish. I heard this from Roberto and Juan Felipe in Colombia, Jose and Francisco in Mexico. They always looked the same as Dennis and Jeffrey, and it wasn't just in South America, but in other places. There they were in Rwanda. That's the French for don't be ridiculous. It's impossible. There they are as Christoph and Matthias in Germany saying don't be ridiculous. It's impossible. And beyond that, they are in many places in Asia. In Thailand, that's the Thai for don't be ridiculous, it's impossible. In Malaysia, that's Bumiputra for don't be ridiculous, it's impossible, etc. And in China. They are everywhere. Their job is to stop income contingent loans. They must have an annual conference and celebrate their success in many countries, although we've got under the radar in some. Obstacle 2, the students. The students weren't very pleased about this. I think they're okay now. The people who were most offended by HECS and most hostile towards it were the ones who were in the system when it was being introduced. And they, in my second chapter of trying to expand the HECS system into a form of voluntary income support, they started a campaign against me. And let me share you some of the experience of that campaign. This was a poster. There was a day of action, defeat the loan scheme, don't let the loan scheme terminate your future. You may not remember this. I remember it. Terminator was the big movie at the time. That's what they compared to the HECS system to. The Terminator was coming to get them. Then there was another poster. What a ridiculous idea student loans are. I was thinking with the first two, well, at least they didn't name me. So I don't feel personally offended or threatened by any of this. But then there was the next slide. I was going to give a seminar at the University of Western Australia. There was turned out to be a demonstration, and that's manifested in the advertisement in the next slide. So here it is. It's all coming together for them. That's right, boys and girls. Dr. Bruce Chapman, who brought us HECS, blah, 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 and other ways to deprive you of an education is coming to a campus. They then had a little dancing metaphor. We've tangoed with Kemp, Minister for Education. We've waltzed with Howard. Let's dance with the devil. Apparently, I'm the devil. There was even a poster, wanted for crimes against education. To me, education is the most important thing that governments do. So I found this a little bit tricky to deal with. And the worst thing is they now knew what I looked like, which meant I could be confronted by some stranger in a supermarket somewhere and challenged as the person who has ruined some student's life and made the entire university system deeply unfair and terrible. It was hard getting stuff published at the beginning. The Farrago newspaper, a student newspaper at the University of Melbourne, wrote an article which I thought was pretty weird and inaccurate and wrong and defamatory. And so I responded to the article with my explanation of what HECS was all about and why I thought it was a reasonable and fair institution. This is the response I got from the editor of Farrago, the Melbourne University Student Union. I'll read it out. It may not be clear to you. Dear Dr. Chapman, thank you for forwarding your article for student newspapers for consideration by Farrago. We have read your paper and regret to inform you that it fails to reach the standards we usually require of our contributors. Further, we view your comments as a cynical attempt to dampen the coordinated efforts of students across the country as we prepared to crush your loan scheme proposal. Your science is a sham. Your co-conspirators are exposed. Your motivations are perverse. Your propositions are clumsy. Your philosophy is antisocial. Your employers are embarrassed. Your days are numbered. I've been rejected by many journals in my time. That was the most unambiguous negative letter I've ever had. So it didn't make Farrago. I want to finish now with some reflections on some contemporary issues. Let's think about COVID for a short time. One thing that we did not anticipate, nobody did, when HECS was introduced, that there would be lockdowns, worldwide lockdowns, because of a pandemic. And that's exactly what happened with COVID. And that sent labour markets, and graduate labour markets specifically, into disarray. A lot of people who were graduating with student loan debts couldn't find jobs in the United States and other countries because businesses were locked down. So this is an illustration of something we did not anticipate, and I'll call it cohort risk. And it is, keep in mind what I said right at the beginning. Repayment hardships are the big problem with student loans, and they can lead to a major concern, which is default. And if you default on a student loan, your commercial life, indeed, your life, is very adversely affected. You won't be able to borrow for a house or a car. You've got a big problem because your credit reputation is damaged. That cannot happen with an income contingent loan. Defaults can also ruin governments' budgets because people get defaulted out of student loan systems. You can't get any more money from them. So there's a major problem. But this problem was not true in Australia with COVID. It wasn't true in New Zealand. It wasn't true in England. It wasn't true in Wales. And it wasn't true in Hungary, because those countries have income contingent loans where lockdowns don't affect the obligation to repay student loans. But they sure do in the other countries. And in places like the United States and Canada, many countries in Asia and in Latin America, student loans were in a terrible bind and governments were in a terrible bind. So COVID showed us something that we didn't understand before. It provides cohort risk. So for the first time in history, for income contingent loan borrowers, an entire cohort, because of something beyond everyone's control, did not damage student loan prospects. And this was the critical point. And it led to major heartache and policy problems in many other countries, including in the United States, where Joe Biden chose to forgive billions of dollars of debt because of the lockdowns associated with COVID. Nobody would have noticed. No debtor in Australia would have noticed because they had a HECS debt, and that was true for the other countries with income contingent loans. I want to say something quickly about the University Accord Review. It's a major contribution. There are some parts of it I think are highly commendable. Some parts I wish more had been done. The things that matter for the short-term politics, the Accord process recommended a change in indexation. I think that is a good idea to make it the lower of wage and prices. It doesn't really matter that much, the indexation, in terms of the overall payments of students, but the politics was looking very bad last year, with people complaining and being encouraged through some fairly, how should I say, misinformed political contributions from people opposed to the system, were saying things which were frightening people. That's being fixed. But the most important point is point number 3. I won't talk about point number 2. The Jobs Ready Graduate Package, introduced by the former coalition government, 2020, changed the prices radically. Prices for humanities went up by more than 100%, and other areas like engineering and maths fell. All the prices now are wrong. They are highly inequitable. Humanities graduates, particularly female humanities graduates, are the lowest earning graduates of all. They're now being asked to pay the most. The motivation for that misguided policy was extraordinary. The economics behind it confused everybody. It had no consequences other than major unfair debt levels, particularly for humanities students. That will be fixed, I presume. I hope it's fixed soon. There's going to be a tertiary education commission established. We are yet to find out whether or not that will have political teeth. I'm not sure. Watch this space. Just one final comment about HECS and the US presidential election. Because COVID made things so difficult for college debtors in the United States, Joe Biden introduced, and it's yet to pass the Congress, a new system, which is an income-contingent loan scheme. Some background is that 35 million students, former students, are student loan debtors in the United States. Next point is that the debt is amazingly huge. It's $1.7 trillion worth of debt. To give you context, that's Australia's annual gross domestic product currently per year. This is amazing. This is the biggest debt problem in world history, particularly in the context of the wrong loan system. Already about 12 to 13 million people have defaulted, and more will if this system is not changed. But the Joe Biden plan, which I presume also will be the Kamala Harris plan, is debt forgiveness coming in for low debts for people currently in the system, and the introduction essentially of HECS. And that is to reduce the prospect to zero of all future defaults. And at the same time, it's going to be cutting the debts because they're cutting the interest rates by 40%. I have no idea what's going to happen in the United States, but if you want to see a major policy distinction between the Democrats and the Republicans, it is student loans. Donald Trump's position on this is to do nothing. It's to not adopt the Biden-Harris plan. So there is more than simply what people look like and what they sound like and what's kind of going on with the rhetoric of politics. There is a major policy distinction now, which has come about because of the very poor design of traditional student loans, design features which are avoided entirely by income-contingent loans, that is, the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. Thank you so much for paying attention and for being here.
Thank you so much for that. It was an absolutely fascinating trip through that long period of which we remember very, very well. Can I just ask, to start off with, a very specific question? You talked about what we called, I think, the graduate premium in England, the amount that graduates made more per annum than non-graduates. And I recall from the time I was in England when something called the National Centre for Social Research did a British Social Attitude Survey, and that would have been about 2011. And we had a figure which made the graduate premium much smaller than it had been in the past, really much smaller. And you know, you can't start thinking about the graduate premium and think of all of those multi-billionaire tech people who didn't graduate. And I wonder what the evidence is about the graduate premium in Australia now. And I'll come back with another bit of this question in a minute.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. One of the things that's true about the lifetime income differences between graduates and non-graduates, what you're calling the graduate premium, it's very stable. So I've looked at this, and many other colleagues have looked at this over a long period, and it really doesn't change very much at all, which is kind of strange because we've got so many more graduates, but we've got so many more graduates of young ages. So the labour force is still dominated by non-graduates. So it takes quite a long time for that increase in supply to change the outcomes, but they are robust. And I've got colleagues who work on England, and they tell me the same, that there haven't been changes in the financial advantages to being graduates in either of those countries, and indeed in any country we've looked at. One of the most robust findings in empirical economics is that premium over time and with its stability. I think one of the things that happened, I haven't done research on this myself, but I'm aware of the literature. There's quite a close connection between rapid changes in the kind of technological change that we have now that are very complementary to the processes of higher education. And I think one of the most important things to understand about higher education is that it teaches people how to learn. So it's not as if you get mechanical skills. Most people don't take what they learn in their particular areas mechanically to the job, but they do take capacity to learn, which means that in worlds of evolving technical change, that's a plus. But I can't conjecture any further as to the reasons. But empirically, there's robustness in what I talked about in terms of the graduate premium.
That's good to know. Of course, it became a very common trope among the Conservative Party in Britain to say that a lot of the universities were teaching people stuff which made them unemployable. And it's not something that we don't hear here.
Well, there was a little bit of that implicitly in the government's change in 2020 towards the prices. The government's rhetoric about that was to say, well, we don't really want too many humanities. We want a labour market which will reward different things. That's another way of saying there are particular areas of university teaching which don't result in important skills, and it may not mean unemployment, but it wasn't desirable. There's no evidence for these propositions, nor was there any prospect that changing those prices would change people's preferences. If you want to be a vet because you like pussycats, you want to be a vet. If you've got an income contingent loan, if you want to be a chartered accountant or a nurse or a doctor, those kind of changes would have no effect, which they didn't. But they will make people unhappy, and they're essentially unfair.
Yes, I think that's a point well taken. I should say that when the other result I remember from that national survey in Britain was that it was a very robust result that graduates in Britain were more likely to vote than non-graduates. Now, that's not going to be replicated in Australia, but I thought that was a very good piece of news. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions. This is from Glenn Withers saying, great talk. Early on you mentioned that income contingent loans for other areas such as drought relief, startups, job seeker and so on have been possible. Why have these not been as widely adopted as HECS in education?
The first point I'd like to make is to say thank you for your question, Glenn. Glenn has been a pioneer in the application of contingent debt relations to business, innovation and research and development. And that work goes back at least 10 years, and it's been, I think, extremely innovative and important as research, not, as he alludes to, why not in policy. But I'll just give you a couple of other examples. Many colleagues have looked at contingent debt, for example, for the extension of paid parental leave beyond the grants. Tim Higgins did that work. For example, John Quiggin thought of the idea of the collection of low-level criminal fines through contingent debt contributions. They're all, I think, we've modelled all these things, and also for innovation in farming, agricultural processes. I wish I knew why they don't get adopted. But one thing I'm fairly confident of is that there is suspicion in the economics people who dominate debate in the mainstream and in the bureaucracy. If they don't know about it too much or there hasn't been tried, resistance, just like the tax office was resistant to HECS, is usually the safest option. I wish I knew, Glenn, because I think there are very important contributions like yours that could be much more very important for public policy reform.
There's a couple of questions, Bruce, relating, I think, to the Conservative or the Liberal Party policy on arts degrees. One of them says, how can we get rid of egregiously high arts fees? Another one said that the HELP debt is in order to discourage or encourage students from studying in particular fields. So it was originally based on expected future earning power, and now it's being should be modelled on skills requirements for governments. Now that's a slightly different question, and I wonder what you'd make of that. I mean, is there any possibility that we could have a HECS debt that was very low for early childhood and aged care degrees, so as to encourage people to move into them. A bit like the teachers' scholarships in our time.
Yeah, that's a philosophy that underpinned the, I think, very poorly thought through price changes in 2020. The basic point about the HECS debt is it's not going to change people's lifetime career plans. It's not big enough. It doesn't impact on people at the point of entry. It gets repaid. For most people, those changes in the humanities charges would have no effect on their lives for about 10 or 12 years, because that's when they start repaying HECS. And if they've got a problem and they can't repay, well, there's insurance against it. So one thing we know about HECS is it won't change people's lifetime plans. It won't influence the nature of labour market composition. It will be unfair. And when the questioner said, well, should it be based on skills or lifetime income advantages, my view is that expected lifetime income is the most fundamental way in equity terms of deciding what a HECS debt should be. What does that mean? It means law should have higher debts, medical specialists should have higher debts, dentists should have higher debts, humanities graduates, lower debts, nurses, lower debts, teachers, lower debts. So the system's never been priced properly at all, actually. This is kind of weird. When it was invented, it was wrong. It was uniform prices, and it went through several gyrations, and then those radical changes in 2020, which were really very poorly thought through, they're the bad ones. What the Accord Review did was to promote the equity point, which I think is the big point. If you in something, we can't anticipate very accurately what you're going to do in your life. That's why we've got instruments like HECS. But the best as we can determine that the people who study law and medical specialty compared to humanities, they'll do fine. And that's the basis recommended by the Accord. It hasn't happened yet. I think the government's well aware of it, and let's see, but I think that they know that this is a problem.
There's another question here about how income contingent loans have worked elsewhere in the world. I'm, because of my time in Britain, more familiar with the hysteria about student debt in Britain. How's it working? I mean, I don't think it's well justified, but how is it working elsewhere in the world? And actually, it might be quite interesting for you to give us a prediction about what's going to happen if Kamala Harris gets in. Will they go entirely income contingent loan?
The second one's tough because I don't know enough about the legislative process in the US, so I won't say anything about that. But it's gone before the courts. It's up to whoever the new president is, what they do with it. With respect to the effects, England's the best example, because the changes in, England as opposed to Britain, because Scotland doesn't actually charge, but Wales does and England does. But when the Tories introduced, when the Blair government introduced a HECS type system, 1998, then it was radically changed to be entirely a HECS system in 2005. Then the Tories won, and the debt went up to an extraordinary amount on paper, £9,000 per year. All the subsidies apparently were eliminated. And a lot of people thought at the time, now you'll see the big effects. It didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is that, first of all, there's no barriers up front. That's really important. But secondly, the money gets used to make the system bigger. And one of the things that I've learned over this 40-year period is if you want to help poor people go to university, the single most important thing that you need is a big university sector and a financing system that doesn't stop people. When you've got an elite system, as England used to have, as Australia used to have, as New Zealand used to have, and you replace it with a system which gets much bigger, then the people from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds have got a way in. The people who come from rich backgrounds, they're always in. If you come from the highest parts of the economic strata,
rich and dumb, even though they may be.
Well, I won't call them dumb, but I know their parents. I know their parents are rich. They're all there, but it's the ones who are not from wealthy backgrounds that are not there. And the single most important thing you can do is make the system bigger. Let me give you one fact from England. After the increase, the huge increase in the student debt and the expansion of the system, the participation of people as measured at age 14 from the very lowest echelons of the socioeconomic background quadrupled. That quadrupled over time. It didn't change at all for the others. So the effects were kind of the opposite of what people thought, because when the system got bigger without upfront problems, the poor get in, and the poor have got in much bigger proportions in England, New Zealand and Australia than previously.
Okay, there's two questions here. One of them is, do we know what proportion of student debts are not repaid over the lifetime?
We do, roughly. It changes because it's certainly going to change with the increases in the charges introduced in 2020, unless they're undone, because many more humanities students won't pay back, particularly female humanities graduates, because they won't live to be 125 to repay a HECS debt. But before those changes, the rough rule of thumb is about 15 to 18% will not be paid. That number has gone up somewhat as the debts have got bigger over time, but it's never been more than 20%. And we know who those people are. They're people who don't graduate, basically. They're people who have bad luck or for whatever reason don't become graduates. They're the ones who get relatively low income. Just about everybody will pay a little bit, but there'll be some people at the end of their working lives who won't pay in full, and for the total debt in aggregate, 15, maybe 18%.
Okay. Randall says, thank you, first in family university student. What are your thoughts on the introduction of interest on HECS?
Well, we have interest of a form. It's indexed to the consumer price index, so not the government cost of borrowing. So when people say, should there be interest, there is a nominal interest in that it's adjusted for inflation. If you made it the government cost of borrowing, it would be a higher rate of interest rather than the CPI. The reason I don't think that's a great idea is that there's a lot of people who will be in the situation, and if the debt is indexed to the real rate of interest and they're underneath the repayment threshold for a few years, with the compounding associated with that interest rate regime, their debts can turn out to be very high, and they're the poor, because we know they're poor because they're not paying back their HECS. So I don't think it's a good idea. I think indexation to the CPI is fair. The government's buying the places for the students. It's reasonable that the government should get back the real purchasing power of its outlays.
All right, that's very interesting. There's a question here, is the problem that conservative governments believe in universities are inherently left-wing?
I don't think I'm qualified to talk about any governments, let alone a specific question about conservative governments being left-wing. So, I mean, possibly, but I don't know. I think it's not appropriate for a citizen like me, who's got citizens' thoughts, to talk about anything beyond what they think that they understand well, and that's, for me, it's HECS.
Well, look, can I just ask you to do what you can in your area of expertise on what has become a really big question about the financing of the higher education system through support from international students, and whether you think this is a tricky question. There's a sort of a moral issue in my mind about using international students to carry the research costs of Australian universities. I think international students are a great thing. It's really good for globalizing knowledge and the like. But I'd be interested in your views, because it's become a particularly hot topic over the last few weeks.
It's a very hot topic. I don't know a lot about the basis of the changing that the government is instituting in terms of caps. I think to understand this properly, you have to understand the link between international students and immigration policy. That's fundamentally driving a lot of this discussion. So it's not really about the financing issues. I can't be confident that I understand the ethics of the research basis, but let me say that I think that your allusion to the likelihood that international student revenues are a dominant part of research income is absolutely clear. Everybody knows this. And I think the tricky thing here is if you change that radically, will the government be able and willing to provide research funding to replace it? I think if in the absence of international student fees, and I might say there are also big cross subsidies going on, in my view, for some of the postgraduate courses. About 50% of the courses, the students in postgraduate areas in public sector universities are paying fees through HECS, where the institutions can charge what they like. So the subsidies coming from there, they're kind of invisible. There are certainly subsidies coming from international students. They're not invisible, but they're really big. And one of the hardest questions of all, which I don't think was raised in as much detail as some people would have hoped, is tell us all about research funding. Is it appropriate or otherwise that it comes from international students or postgraduates? But I will say, in the context of the establishment of the Australian Tertiary Education Commission, I'm hoping that, as well as revisiting the basic problem with the charging levels across the disciplines, that they look more closely than we have previously into research funding.
Thank you, Bruce. There's one last question here. Should HECS be provided for living costs as for students as well as for fees? There is an there was an Oz study component, I think, in the past.
There was, and I was involved in that, and it was an attempt to give people in very high cost areas like the middle of Sydney compared to low cost areas like Wagga some chance to target their own income needs through a trade-in voluntary. That didn't happen. I think the system as a grant system is an okay system. I would certainly not think, and strongly not think, that there is any case for changing grants into loans. That's a critical point. But I also think that the right way to think about this is that if you want to expand income support for particular groups, then you can do that through some extensions of the grant. But you could, let's say you thought, we don't have enough nurses. Now, we kind of don't have enough nurses, but it's not because there aren't enough graduates in nursing. They're not in the nursing system. You could use the HECS arrangements to direct labour market choices once people graduate. So, for example, in nursing or teaching or childcare or other areas, you could say, conditional on you being in that occupation, you don't have to pay HECS for a year, and we'll forgive the HECS as well. I think that's a way of using the loan scheme which addresses the income support a bit, but I wouldn't be changing the grants system up front.
Okay, we've now just got two more, so I'll keep going. Whitlam introduced, this is from Chris B. Whitlam introduced no fee education on the principle that society owes everyone an education up to their ability. Essentially the same principle as that society owes everyone free health. Would you like to see income contingent loans instead of Medicare?
No, and the reason is that there's no systematic relationship between the accidents and the bad luck that come in with health. I think it is justified to have universal healthcare coverage. There's something absolutely systematic about parental background and wealth and the achievement and the access to higher education, which brings up the equity point in ways that distinguish those two different types of policy.
Yeah. Now, Don Hector asks, and I'll be interested in what Finland and France provide citizens with tertiary education at much lower cost. In fact, it's free in France. Why did we abandon the subsidies, presumably for the equity reasons?
Well, that's my view. I think that just to revisit the Whitlam government's abolition of fees in 1974, it's kind of an odd thing for me to say, but I think their motivation was similar to HECS. It was to remove pricing and financial barriers at the point of entry. That's the critical point. So I think that was that was shared between the abolition. What was different about HECS was that it required repayments conditional on success through the process. And the important point about that was that that allowed the university system. So I don't think there's any case that I would make beyond what I said at the beginning. A no-charge system is one which distributes over the lifetime advantages to relatively advantaged people, certainly after they graduate, but also at the point of entry. So the equity point, I think, is still strong and important. I can't see any way around the basic proposition that even though we might say it is a right and a privilege, I mean, I might say food and shelter is a right and a privilege too, but people don't get those without charge. The role of government is to ensure that the disadvantaged are protected and to institute policies which are essentially progressive and not regressive. And not charging people who go to university is essentially a regressive approach.
Okay. Has the ATO, asks our president, accepted that there's a benefit to tax revenue from HECS?
Look,
that all their balloons are evidence they do.
I just think they're fantastic. What were they supposed to do when some boffin turns up with some idea that no one had tested, that he didn't seem to understand, and their first thought was, oh my God, this will be a disaster. So I've got nothing but admiration for the tax office to resisting what they did until it was shown to work. The legislation they designed was fantastic, and they kind of got famous. So the reason that they celebrated it was not because they wanted the credit, was because I think they were just relieved that it worked out okay and it became popular. Lots of other tax officers visited them to say, well, this system works, tell me how you do it. So I think after a few years, they thought this was pretty okay. And the way they acted was very professional.
It's an absolutely fantastic story. There's one absolutely last question, which I'm not sure I fully understand. It's an anonymous question. It seems that basing costs on a potentially fallible expectation of future earnings should mean that indexing isn't necessary. Indexing is only fair if the debt is based on the cost paid by the government. How is it fair to inflate the debt in expectation of future ability to pay and index it as well?
Well, think about what a HECS position means. I've just enrolled in universities. I'm committed to repay the government for my place. The place costs taxpayers something like $20,000, $18,000 per full-time student year. So when the government puts out that outlay for every individual student, that's coming from taxpayers. When it's indexed just to this consumer price index, when it gets repaid, the government, for being involved in this process, only gets back in real terms what it's spent. So they're not making any money out of it. They don't have a real interest rate on it beyond zero. I think if the system was not income contingent in repayment, I'd be much more likely to agree, but it does offer the protections. And it's basically the government protecting its budget in a way that I think is fair, so long as the debt is repaid depending on future income.
Look, we must stop now. So, Bruce, I want to thank you for what I found as a really moving piece of oral history. I mean, for those of us of a certain age, I think it reminds us of this history, reminds us of those drivers that higher education is a public good, has to be equitably distributed, but also that it needs to be paid for. And how hard it is to keep all of that in balance. That history was, I mean, I loved all of the anecdotes of Dawkins and the others, and it really was quite a visionary government at the time. 2 years ago at a Royal Society of New South Wales forum at Government House, a young woman from Parramatta was talking, and she said then, or quoted a statistic, that there were more people going, a higher proportion of students from Western Sydney, Parramatta area, were going to university than from the northern suburbs of Sydney. That gave me a jolt, and it's thanks to you, Bruce. I think that is a fantastic outcome. So it's a really important thing that's happened, and I think we can only be extremely grateful that this somewhat, as you say, somewhat outrageous idea finally broke through and was taken by government. And I think the other thing, I think for the younger, for those who aren't of a certain age, who are than certain age, perhaps understanding that extraordinarily strong ethical imperative that was driving the introduction is really important. I think it's very easy as we watch the current debates of sectional interests in the higher education system and in others to forget that we were all trying so hard to get things right for our society. And I think, Bruce, that you've reminded us of that. And I just think, as I say, it's an extraordinary piece of understanding of government and how government worked and how those processes came out for once with a really good outcome. So thank you very, very much. And I found it really fantastic. And now I hand over to the president to close the meeting.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you for conducting the Q&A so well. And of course, for Bruce, for joining us tonight. The Society is privileged to have you present. It was a fascinating presentation. We could have conversed about the subject all night, but it's my job, because it is an ordinary general meeting of the Society, to close proceedings and welcome those who did watch to tell their neighbours, colleagues, networks that this will be available very soon on our YouTube channel. So please spread the word far and wide, because this is a really important subject for Australia, that in fact, in the midst of all the bad news, is a really good news story, thanks to Bruce. So thank you, Bruce.